Well, welcome everybody this morning to our special service that we're having this morning. I'm just so glad to be with you all, to see you all this Sunday. Again, I can't say how thankful I am, and I'm sure all of you are, that we don't have to wear our masks and all these restrictions that we have are finally ending. It's like you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Yet, when we look around and we really pay attention, many of the griefs and losses that people suffered still endure and affect life today. So while we might want to go on acting like last year never happened, we are acutely aware that there's been a lot of loss and a lot of trials this year. And what is grief? And a grief happens through any loss that you go through. Some of us, we might think grief only applies to when people pass away, but it really applies also to lost jobs and lost opportunities. Things as simple as missing graduations or celebrations are the depths of trouble when we lose the comfort of having many of our loved ones around for funerals. Missed time with kids and grandkids, some of you have had. The list could go on for a long time on the different things just in our church that people have lost. But one thing is common to all of our losses. We all want our griefs to end immediately, like right now. I want to get through it. For a lot of people, feeling grief, especially after the tragedy seems to happen, feels like a weakness, a lack of inner strength. It's because we live in a sitcom world. You know, you sit down, you start a show, and there's a tragedy in the first 2 or 3 minutes, or some problem in the first 2 or 3 minutes. And by the time you get to the 30-minute mark and the show is over, it's all been resolved, everything's good, everybody lives happily ever after. Before the time of TV on demand, there was something I really, really hated to see. You're coming to the end of a show, you think you're fixing to reach a big resolution of everything, and then all of a sudden across the screen it says, "To be continued." And you go, no! I want whatever problem resolved now, not next week, now. And we do that with church too. We come with our knowing we have some issues, but man, we want to walk out knowing everything's satisfied, everything's good, we're good, and we can move on with happily ever after until we reach this week's trial. But that's not how grief really works. And we see this in the Bible. It's full of psalms of lament, prayers of sorrow, even a whole book called Lamentations. Lament means a sorrow, where people grieve here toward God with all of their emotions. And they have these times of deep sorrow, and then you'll see waves of grief where there's moments of hope and then down deep into grief again. And then we get to the grief really fast. But this happens and they write over a great deal of time about what they're going through. And this morning I want to read from Lamentations chapter 3 and just give you a taste of Lamentations 3's time of sorrow, of darkness, grief, and despair, so that we can all understand how it's okay to talk to God. Here's what Lamentations 3 says. "I am a laughingstock to all my people, mocked by their songs all the day long. He, being God, filled me with bitterness, satiated me with wormwood. He ground my teeth on gravel and made me cower in the dust. My soul has been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is." And then I thought, my future is lost, as well as my hope from the Lord. There are times in life we feel this way too. Sometimes it's as dark as that, and sometimes it's a grief that's a little bit lighter, but it all comes with a sense of loss. And what I want you to do this morning is I want you, whether you're here, whether you're online, is to take just a moment. And I'm going to step away for a moment. I want you to write down the things that you have lost this year. Missed opportunities, missed relationships, whatever it happens to be. What are the things that you have lost or missed out on this last year? So that we have to recognize what these things are so that we can give them to the Holy Spirit and let Him bring light into our lives. So let's take a moment as you write down the different losses that you've encountered this year. Well, I am excited to be back and going through 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, but I know it's been quite a while since I've been up here to preach on 1 Thessalonians due to the nose surgery and stuff. So I want to catch you up just a little bit on the series. The series title is A Compelling Church. How do we be a compelling church? And in particular, in chapter 4 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul is describing what it takes to be a good disciple. He says it in this way in the first verse, how that you ought to walk to please God. And first, in the first part of the chapter, he talks about the things that we need to get out of our lives, certain desires and habits and addictions that need to go out of our life. But then he takes a moment and he says, here's what you need to work on. Love one another. You're already doing good, he said, but love one another even more so. And then he tells them, in order to build up their discipleship to look like Christ, that how they ought to act around others in the world. He says, mind your own business. Work with your hands. Be a hard worker. And somehow, we think that's kind of all there is to being a disciple. Those three things, get out with skin, how we act with the church, how we act with the world. But Paul knows that there is a great threat to our discipleship that a lot of people don't think about. And that is that a compelling church must deal with loss and grief in a biblical way. And as I began to think upon this, and I wondered, as I've seen the many tears cried throughout this year, and maybe tears that should have been cried that weren't, what's in a tear? Now, scientists study what's in just about everything, like anything. They can tell you down to the molecule what's in stuff. So I wondered, could we actually see chemical differences in when we're grieving or maybe laughing so hard that we can't control ourselves, right? But analysis shows that there's three different kind of tears. The first kind of tear is just the common tear that's on your eye all the time that keeps it moist. And when your eyes feel dry, you shut them and close them. And those kind of tears wet your eyes. They're the most basic kind of tear. And the second tear is like when you get something in your eye. Your body puts something extra in your tear, and it helps to dislodge whatever's in there and also helps it heal. That's the second kind of tear. But I was really more curious about the third kind of tear. The third kind of tear is an emotional tear. Now, emotional tears, it says, has all of these extra ingredients that are in there. And I said, I'm not surprised. A lot happens in your bodies. A lot happens in us when we're having emotions. And what the interesting thing is the chemical ratios and how that changes is different depending on whether you're angry or you're full of joy kind of tears or whether you're grieving. So God has allowed us to put certain things in our tears. He's put certain things in our tears when we're grieving to help us deal with life. Now, I think also God has put something else into a Christian's tear that only the poets really lyric. Poets have known always that love and dreams and desires, even understanding and fear and the loss of many of those things such as love, they all come together to form our most profound tears. And when you grieve really hard, it is as though you're forced into this wine press where all of those things come pouring out of your life and you almost feel drained of life. That's where the Thessalonians had found themselves as their loved ones had died, and they really didn't have a good idea of what was going to happen to them. Had they lost them forever? But Paul knows that God has put an ingredient in the tear of a saint that no one else has. Here's what he says in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. Hope. He says, other people don't have this in their tears, but as saints, we have hope. How this changes our tears, we will see over the next few weeks. But know, as you grieve, as you're in sense of loss, there's light at the end of the tunnel. You remember Paul here, he doesn't say, do not grieve as others. He says, do not grieve as they who have no hope. Don't grieve in the same way. You get to grieve. You must grieve, but you grieve with hope as an ingredient in your tears. And now that we know that there's light at the end of the tunnel, we could take a look and take an account. And we want hope in our lives. Sometimes we need to grieve. So what is grief, and how do we handle it biblically? It's incredibly important to understand this. So grief and grieving all occur after any sense of loss, as I said earlier today. But obviously, the magnitude of the grief depends on what you lost and how important and how attached you were to it. For some people, it might hit you like a hurricane. It might smack you like a hammer, and you just go down on your knees. But for a lot of people, especially unobserved grief, it slowly erodes your life. Grief, though, I can tell you this, it comes to us all. It is inevitable. This is where that list of losses starts to come in handy, because you need to identify the losses in your life so that your discipleship does not get eroded. Because there are consequences to grieving without knowing it, grieving without asking God for hope in it. Paul knows that grief has its effects. He says it in several places. Sometimes it comes out in anger, bitterness, gossip, depression, addictions, isolation, or maybe a fear of isolation, so you constantly have to be around people. It can come in a many variety of ways. Many, I can't even list all the ones. But obviously, we go, you know what, I don't feel like I'm grieving, because we think the only right reason to really grieve is through death. I call that the ultimate grief that we face. But God's hope not only applies to this ultimate grief that Paul is very particularly talking about, but every grief we have. And in our world, it's hard to recognize and to grieve and cry without thinking to ourselves, I'm just weak, I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough. Or maybe thinking, I'm not faithful because I'm grieving. And in fact, I would say in churches, we've had a hard time with this. Biblical lament or any kind of grief seems unholy in some of our holier-than-thou contest, which is so rampant in many of our evangelical churches. But the Bible, which is what we really base our life on, is full of lament. Not only in the Old Testament, where it's just in the Psalms and all over the place, but it's also Jesus laments. He is full of moments of sorrow and times of sorrow. You know, I was thinking one of the most profound verses in the whole Bible is also one of the shortest verses, and the shortest in English. It just says, Jesus wept. He wept when he lost the one he loved, his friend Lazarus. He wept because he loved. He didn't jump ahead to what we all know called raising him from the dead. He's like, oh, that's no big deal. I'm going to raise him from the dead anyway. Just like you wouldn't just dismiss someone you had lost because they're going to meet him in heaven someday. No, Jesus wept. He stood and wept. Just as we stand and weep as we wait. But John calls the resurrection of Lazarus a sign of what Jesus is going to accomplish for himself first and for us. But in the meantime, we weep because we love. Weeping while knowing something is coming and greater than we imagine. We can weep because Jesus gives us hope. But what we got to talk about for a moment is what happens when hope doesn't enter into our grief. Grieving without hope leads to despair. Despair is a very unique word. It isn't the same thing as depression. It's to come to a point in your life when you look out into the future and you're guessing what your life is going to mean, what it's going to look like, and all you see is darkness, pain, meaningless, and loss. Like the same old stories of pain are just going to be your forever eternity. But we know, and we see here, especially in Lamentations, despair and discipleship are related. Despair destroys discipleship when it comes, if we let it sneak into our lives. And also, poor discipleship, it leaves that heart open to despair. And if you're not a prepared disciple and you enter into despair, you're just going to have this slow, downturning, twisting cycle downward. In despair, salvation itself sounds like a myth. It sounds like folly for the fools. In grief, poor discipleship says, you're not supposed to be angry with God. You need to suck it up, buttercup. It says God is going to make everything right now, or he's not a real God. It says that God only cares, loves, and approves of people who are happy. Poor discipleship says God can't do anything about what happened to me or what I did. And it says, despair says, you are all alone. But mostly, despair, when we find out what happens, it's a story problem in our lives. Again, despair is based on the stories we tell ourselves about our future, even the future of the world. And we are in a world right now with a lot of competing narratives, a lot of people trying to tell you what the real story is. And if you haven't realized that in this last year with all the competing narratives, then I think you must be all by yourself and alone. To control the narrative is to control people's hopes and dreams. Everyone wants to control it. But let's read what Paul says about the center of the story of a Christian. What is the center of our story? What is the story that we know is true? Verse 14 says, right after what we read, he says this, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. This is more than a statement of fact, although it is a fact. But Paul is saying for those who take Jesus as the key to the whole story of life, then God will include us in that same story. You see, it's a story. He talks about what Jesus did. He died and he rose again and ascended. And he talks about what's going to happen to us. It's past. We're living in the present, which is still full of grief and tragedy, but also what God is going to do. So what I'm telling you is to think about what is the primary story that you believe about reality. What is a story you tell yourself about who you are? What is a story you tell yourself about if you're loved or if you're worthy? That take his time on the cross. Think about Jesus as he's grieving. When we start to think about the story of grief, how do we deal with this grief? Jesus, when he was on the cross, he quoted the first verse of Psalm 22. He said, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is a true lament filled with sorrow at the separation between himself and his Father. In other words, he came and lived in a similar sense as we did. He came into our story and lived our suffering. He lived our separation from the Father. He knows what it's like to lose. He felt our darkest hour. He felt your darkest hour. And he came and he took our dark future, our voidless despair in death. He took that upon himself. And he gives us his resurrection life. You know, we live in a dark world full of stories of despair. Now, people don't like to tell themselves that. They try to make up their own hope, make up their own meaning. It's not good enough. People are still grinding into meaninglessness. Our question today is, where is the hope? Where is the hope for your life? If you're going to be able to deal with the grief you're in or the grief that's coming, where is your hope for your future? Does it come from saying, you know what, I'm a real hard worker, I'm going to make my future? Does it come from your family, your bank account, your good health? Maybe it's in the value of how others think of you and love you. But I tell you what, any of that stuff breaks and hope is gone. There's only one hope that is worth investing your life in. There's only one way through any and all grief. This morning I want you to take your losses and your grief, and I want you to take them into account and hold them to God and let Him have those worries and those cares and those griefs, because there is no other hope. There is no other future than in Christ. It is as when Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted."